I was home alone on a Saturday night in late November. My parents had gone out to a dinner party, and I had the house to myself for the first time in months. The sky was overcast, the kind of night where the clouds pressed close to the ground and made the world feel smaller. Inside, the house was quiet, the usual noises of family life absent. The heating system hummed low, and the lights cast long, soft shadows across the walls. I had spent the evening tidying up and preparing snacks, moving through the house with the sense of calm that comes from being completely alone. The first hour passed uneventfully. I watched television with the volume low, occasionally glancing at the windows where the streetlights reflected off the glass. The reflections of the furniture and the dark shapes of the rooms made the house feel larger than it was, and I noticed the way familiar corners and hallways seemed strange under the thin yellow light. I told myself it was just the absence of people, that the house felt different because it was empty, but a subtle unease had begun to settle in my chest. I went into the kitchen to make tea, and the sound of my footsteps on the wooden floorboards seemed louder than it should have. The boards creaked under each step, and I became aware of how hollow the house sounded when no one else was moving through it. As I poured water into the kettle, I thought I heard a faint scraping noise behind me. I froze and listened, the kettle between my hands, but the kitchen was empty. The sound stopped almost immediately, and I told myself it was a floorboard shifting or the wind against the window. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound had been deliberate, like something had moved with intention. Returning to the living room, I decided to check the locks on the doors and windows. The back door was old and had a tricky latch, and I made sure it clicked into place. I ran my hands along each window frame, confirming they were secure. The effort should have been comforting, but instead it made me more aware of the fragility of the house, of the way it could be breached. I walked slowly through each room, noting the corners and shadows, the way the furniture cast shapes that seemed sharper and darker than usual. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was dense, almost tangible. After a while, I sat back on the couch, trying to focus on the television again. The screen was bright and familiar, but the quiet sounds of the house drew my attention away. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The soft creak of a floorboard in the hallway, the radiator letting off a small hiss, the faint thump of the pipes. At first, I accepted them as ordinary, but soon I started noticing patterns, small irregularities. A floorboard would creak after I stepped on another one. A pipe would hiss shortly after I shifted position in the living room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it gave the impression of the house reacting to me, observing me in some intangible way. I went upstairs to check my bedroom, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Each step on the staircase groaned under my weight, louder than it had any right to. The hallway outside my room was darker than usual, and I paused in the landing, straining my ears. There was a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the far end of the hall, near the guest room. My heart rate increased. I crept closer, careful with each step, but when I reached the door, nothing had moved. Everything was in place as it should be. Still, the feeling of being watched remained, heavier and more insistent than it had before. I returned downstairs, trying to occupy myself with chores. I cleaned the countertops and organized the pantry, noting each small noise as I worked. The scraping sound returned, this time in the kitchen, slow and deliberate, like something being dragged lightly across the floor. I stopped and listened, every muscle tense, but nothing was visible. I circled the room, checking cabinets, the refrigerator, under the sink, but everything was normal. The sound ceased as abruptly as it had begun. I realized I was holding my breath, and I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the racing in my chest. I spent the next few hours moving cautiously through the house. I left lights on in the living room and kitchen, but the shadows still shifted unnaturally, and the darkness beyond them seemed deeper than it should have been. My senses were heightened. Every creak, every hum, every draft felt amplified. I noticed the pattern of the noises, the way they seemed to follow me from room to room, always just out of reach, never explained. I felt a persistent tension, the kind that sits low in your stomach and makes your muscles tight, your thoughts scattered. Eventually, I gathered blankets and pillows and made a nest in the living room, where I could see the hallway and the front door. I stayed there for hours, alert and watchful, listening to the house around me. The scraping and tapping stopped, the floorboards settled, and the hum of the radiator became steady. I realized that the night had passed without incident, that I had endured hours of heightened awareness and fear without anything actually threatening me. The quiet that had once been oppressive now felt ordinary again, natural, and I began to relax slightly. When the first light of dawn appeared, it softened the shadows and illuminated the familiar furniture and walls. The house was just a house again. Nothing had moved, nothing had entered. The noises were explained by the natural settling of an old structure and the sounds of pipes and heating systems. I felt a wave of relief and a quiet satisfaction in having endured the night, in understanding that the fear had been real but not caused by anything external. I spent the morning opening windows to let in fresh air, sunlight spilling across the floorboards. The house smelled clean, normal, lived in. I reflected on the night, realizing that being alone in the dark had magnified every ordinary sound, every small movement, and every shadow into something tense and alarming. The experience left me more aware of my surroundings, cautious but not paranoid. I learned that fear could exist entirely within the mind, fueled by isolation and expectation, and that endurance was possible even when every instinct screamed otherwise. From that night on, I took small precautions whenever I was alone. Checking locks, leaving lights on, monitoring the sounds of the house. I never felt unsafe in the presence of reason, but I understood the weight that silence and emptiness could carry. The house remained the same as it had always been, ordinary and predictable. Yet the memory of that night lingered, a quiet reminder of the tension that could exist in familiar spaces when they were empty and dark. I had faced the night alone, and in doing so, I had learned how fragile certainty can feel and how strong the mind can be when confronted with its own unease. Late November 2014 settled into that quiet gray stretch outside Spokane where daylight felt thin and evenings arrived early. I was staying alone in my aunt's rental house at the end of a gravel road while she recovered from surgery out of state. She needed someone to keep an eye on the place and feed her plants. I needed silence to finish a freelance editing job with a hard deadline. The arrangement felt practical. The house sat back from the road, woods pressing in behind it, one neighbor far enough away that their porch light looked like a star through trees. The road carried sound poorly. When cars passed, the noise arrived late and left fast. The house itself was a long, single-story place with an attached garage and a laundry room that opened to the backyard. The woods began just beyond the lawn, thick with pine and fir, needles layered deep. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and old carpet cleaner. Everything worked. The locks were solid. The windows closed tight. I checked all of it the first afternoon because I always do. I unpacked, set up my laptop at the dining table, and planned to keep to myself. The first night passed without anything worth noting. Wind moved through the trees. The furnace cycled on and off. I slept in the guest room and woke once to the sound of an owl. By morning, nothing felt off. I worked most of the day, editing until my eyes hurt, stopping only to make food. The light outside faded early. I locked the doors before bed without thinking much about it. The second night, the power flickered twice. It was brief, more like a blink. Only the lights inside the house went out and came back. The porch light stayed on, steady and yellow, shining through the front window. That stood out because storms had been moving through the area, and power issues usually affected everything at once. I walked through the house and checked outlets. The clocks reset. The stove clock blinked 12 o'clock. I told myself it was the wiring. Old houses did that. I went to bed later than usual, my head full of track changes and deadlines. Around 2:10 a.m., I woke up fully alert, not drifting, not confused. Something moved across the kitchen floor. It was slow. It sounded like weight shifting carefully, heel to toe, not a scrape or a scurry. It crossed from one side of the kitchen toward the refrigerator. I lay still and listened. The sound stopped. I waited longer than felt comfortable, then got up and turned on the hall light. The kitchen looked normal. Chairs tucked in, counters clear, no spills. The refrigerator door was closed, but when I put my hand near the seal, it was warm, not room temperature, like it had been opened within minutes. I stood there holding the door edge, listening to the compressor hum. I had not been in the kitchen since before bed. I checked the back door. It was locked. The windows were closed. I walked every room and found nothing. I slept poorly after that, light on, door open. Over the next 2 days, small changes appeared. They were not dramatic. That was the problem. A chair at the dining table angled out slightly when I knew I had pushed it in. The thermostat read lower than I had set it, not by much, but enough to notice in the morning cold. One afternoon, I found the back door unlocked. I was careful with locks. I checked them out of habit. I told myself I could have made a mistake. Stress does that. Deadlines do that. I stopped sleeping in the guest room and moved to the living room. I left lamps on. The house felt different at night. The quiet had texture now. The woods no longer sounded distant. They pressed close to the walls. Every creak carried weight. I worked during the day and tried not to think about it. At night, I lay on the couch and watched shadows shift as the furnace kicked on. On the 4th night, it rained. Cold, steady rain that turned the gravel road dark and slick. I had been up late again, finishing a section of work, when I noticed damp footprints in the laundry room. They were muddy, clear enough to see tread patterns. They came in from the back door and stopped near the hallway. They did not turn back. They did not lead anywhere else. I checked the door. It was locked. I looked at my shoes. None matched the prints. The size looked wrong anyway, wider, heavier. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the floor. The prints had not been there earlier. I had done laundry that afternoon. The floor had been clean. The realization settled slowly, heavy and unavoidable. Someone had been inside the house while I was there, or while I slept. I did not call out. I did not search the house again. I gathered what I needed quietly. Phone, keys, wallet, laptop. I left through the front door and drove until the house was out of sight. I sat in my car on the side of the road, engine running, and thought through what I knew. No broken windows, no forced entry. Power flickers isolated to the house. Porch light unaffected. Thermostat changes. Refrigerator opened. Muddy prints that did not leave. In the morning, I returned with daylight and clarity. I walked the perimeter. The woods behind the house were thick, but there was a narrow path worn down near the back fence, barely visible unless you looked for it. It led to a low spot behind the house where the foundation met the ground. There, a crawlspace vent cover sat loose, not fallen, but set aside. The opening behind it was dark. Inside, I found the breaker panel in the garage. One breaker showed signs of recent use, scuffed slightly, like fingers had brushed it often. That explained the flickering lights inside the house without affecting the porch light, which ran on a different circuit. The thermostat was accessible from the hallway. The refrigerator had been opened quietly, then closed. The back door had been unlocked from the inside. I contacted the property manager and local authorities without stepping back into the house alone again. An inspection followed. In the crawlspace, they found evidence of someone staying there. A flattened area of insulation. A blanket folded thin. Empty food wrappers stuffed into a corner. Mud tracked in through the vent opening. The prints in the laundry room stopped at the hallway because the person had removed their shoes before moving deeper into the house, then returned to the crawlspace without leaving new prints. The person had likely been entering the house late at night, using the crawlspace as cover. The woods provided concealment. The distance to the neighbor meant no one saw movement. They used the breaker to cut interior lights briefly, checking if anyone reacted. When nothing happened the first time, they grew bolder. They adjusted the thermostat for comfort. They opened the refrigerator. They moved chairs. Small tests to see if the house was truly empty. I was not supposed to be there. The house had been vacant before my aunt left town. Someone had learned that. When I arrived, they did not leave. They adapted. The crawlspace vent was secured properly. The locks were changed. Motion lights were installed. I did not stay another night. I finished my work elsewhere, hands shaking for days after. Nothing supernatural had happened in that house. There were no shadows that vanished or sounds without cause. There was a person who believed they were alone and acted like it. The fear came from how quietly they fit into the house's rhythm, how easily normal life masked their presence, and how close I had been without knowing it. I had been alone in the house for only a few hours, but the quiet was already pressing against me. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me with strict instructions to lock all the doors and stay inside. The house was older, a small two-story in a suburban neighborhood, with narrow hallways and wood floors that creaked under any movement. The walls had a faint yellow tint from years of paint and sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of cleaning products mixed with the lingering odor of the fireplace. It was a normal home, the kind I had grown up in, yet being alone at night made every familiar detail feel strange and new. The evening had started with mundane tasks. I made myself a simple dinner, washed the dishes, and turned on the television to fill the silence. But once the show ended, I was left with only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. The darkened windows reflected the interior of the rooms back at me, making the house seem larger and emptier than it actually was. I walked from the kitchen to the living room, noticing how every creak of the floor sounded louder in the stillness. Around 9, I decided to check that all the doors and windows were locked. The back door, sliding and old, required several tries to ensure it had latched correctly. I pulled on each knob and pushed on the windows, double-checking that they were secure. Everything was in order. I told myself it was just habit, but a small knot of unease had begun to form in my stomach. After sitting down with a book in the living room, I noticed the subtle sounds that the empty house made at night. The pipes groaned faintly, the radiator hissed as it cooled, and the wind outside rattled the shutters. At first, I barely registered them, but then I became conscious of the fact that the sounds were not random. The creaks in the hallway seemed to follow me when I walked. The radiator hissed a little louder when I sat near it, and the wind's rattling pattern matched the times I glanced toward the windows. My awareness of these ordinary noises intensified them, making them feel deliberate. I tried to distract myself by turning on more lights, illuminating the living room and hallway. Shadows were cast along the walls, and I felt them move in unnatural ways as I shifted position. Every time I stood, a floorboard groaned behind me, even when I had just stepped on it. My mind searched for explanations. The house settling, old pipes, a branch hitting the window. None of them fully satisfied the tension that had settled in my chest. I decided to check upstairs, mostly to reassure myself that the bedroom and hallways were empty. The staircase creaked under my weight, each step louder than it should have been. I reached the landing and paused, listening. The only sound was my own breathing and the faint hum of the heater. I walked slowly down the hall, glancing into the rooms I never used. Everything was in place. No one was there, yet the feeling of being observed remained, prickling along my spine. Returning downstairs, I tried to occupy myself with the television again, but the volume I had chosen for comfort seemed too low. Every creak and rattle became sharper, more pronounced. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate thump from the kitchen. I froze, ears straining. The sound came again, just once, then silence. I told myself it was a dropped dish or the refrigerator settling, but my stomach tightened. I crept toward the kitchen, careful to step lightly. The room appeared normal. The counters were clear, the sink empty, and nothing seemed out of place. Still, the impression that someone or something had moved there lingered. I returned to the living room and decided to keep the lights on, though the glow made the shadows longer and the darkness beyond them deeper. I sat on the couch, pulling a blanket over my legs, trying to convince myself it was just fear amplifying ordinary sounds. That's when I noticed the faint scraping along the hallway floorboards. Slow, measured, almost rhythmic. My pulse spiked. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source, but the house was empty. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I moved closer to the hallway, gripping the edge of the couch. The scraping started again, this time coming from the far end, near the front door. My heart raced. I had locked that door, checked it twice. The sound grew closer, deliberate, almost purposeful. I realized then that even if it was my imagination, my body could not ignore the panic rising inside me. I backed into the kitchen, feeling the floorboards beneath me as fragile as paper. I turned on every light in the house, hoping to illuminate some rational explanation. The front door, the windows, the stairwell, all secure, all empty. I could feel the tension coiling tighter, a physical weight pressing against my chest. Every small noise, the faucet dripping, the wind outside, the hum of the refrigerator, was magnified, like the house itself was listening. I stayed in the kitchen for what felt like hours, moving only to glance at the front door, the windows, and the hallway leading to the living room. Eventually, I realized I had to settle down. I gathered blankets and pillows, setting them up in the living room near the television, the area I could monitor easily. I sat down, knees pulled to my chest, listening to the house breathe around me. Minutes stretched, then hours, and slowly the tension began to ease. The scraping and thumping had stopped. The floorboards groaned less frequently. The radiator hissed rhythmically like a living clock. I remained alert, but the initial panic ebbed into a cautious calm. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared through the windows, I had begun to relax. The sun's light softened the shadows, reduced the strange angles of furniture and walls that had seemed threatening in the dark. The house returned to itself, ordinary and mundane. I could see the familiar contours of the rooms, the patterns on the walls, the clutter I had left scattered. Everything was exactly as it should be. I learned that night that being alone at night in a house can warp perception, turning ordinary noises into threats and empty spaces into sources of anxiety. Nothing had entered the house. Nothing had moved without explanation. I had not been in danger from another person. Yet my fear had been real, driven entirely by isolation and the heightened awareness that comes with being completely alone in the dark. After that night, I installed better locks and left a few lights on whenever I was home alone after dark. I moved more cautiously through the house, aware of every floorboard and the sound of the wind. I never felt the same complete comfort in that house again, but I understood the experience as a lesson. The mind can create a terror almost as convincing as reality when left alone with itself. The house was always empty, but the night had shown me how alive the silence could feel. I moved into my first apartment alone in August 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, when most of the world felt frozen. It was a basement unit in an older duplex, the kind of place that had cheap rent because it had never been updated. The walls were painted a dull beige, the carpet threadbare and stiff underfoot, and the ceiling low enough that I had to stoop slightly to avoid brushing my head against the exposed beams. The windows were small and high, letting in narrow slits of light that barely reached the corners of the room. I took it because it was cheap and available immediately, the landlord insisting it would be perfect for someone who just needed a place to live. I thought I could handle it. I had been eager to live alone, even if it was in a basement, even if the town itself was quiet to the point of forgetfulness. First, it felt normal. The pipes groaned and knocked occasionally, the heater rattled, and the water in the shower sputtered unevenly. I told myself it was just the building settling, the kind of minor imperfections you accepted when you lived somewhere older. I unpacked the basics and set my laptop on a small desk by the window. I left my books stacked on the floor, my clothes in the drawers, and the apartment, for the first night, felt like mine. The silence was almost comforting, a sharp contrast to the lockdown chaos outside, where every trip to the store felt like walking through a different world. The first strange thing I noticed was timing. At night, when I was in the shower, I would hear light, deliberate footsteps above me. They weren't heavy, not like someone stomping, but there was a rhythm, a slow pacing that seemed conscious. The upstairs unit was empty. The landlord had confirmed it before I signed the lease. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the sound echoing strangely through the old floorboards. But it became a pattern. When I was cooking, the sound stopped completely, almost as if someone had paused to watch me from above. When I left the apartment for groceries or work, the noises returned immediately. I couldn't explain it, but it started to make me wary. I found myself listening in every room, moving slowly through the apartment, counting steps and timing them against the faint creaks that seemed to respond. I began sleeping lightly. Every bump and thud startled me. At first, I left the lights on, but eventually, I turned them off, trying to convince myself that I could get used to it. That was when the sound in the storage room started. The storage room was across the hall, a small, windowless space lined with boxes I hadn't opened yet. It had a deadbolt, which I always kept locked. At around 11:41 night, I heard something that made my stomach drop. It was breathing, slow, steady, measured, not strained or hurried, but undeniably human. I froze, listening, my body stiff with tension. My own breathing sounded loud in my ears, shallow and panicked. I convinced myself it was a mechanical echo at first, some draft from the pipes, until I realized it was a rhythm that had a weight to it, a pattern that no machine could produce. I forced myself to open the door. The smell hit me first, a musty, sour tang of old sweat mixed with damp fabric. It filled the space, settling in my nose, thick and suffocating. My boxes were all where I had left them. Nothing was missing, except for a folded blanket sitting neatly on top. I didn't own it, hadn't brought it with me, hadn't seen it in the apartment before. My hands shook as I lifted it, felt the rough, slightly worn fabric, and set it aside. I searched the room meticulously, checking behind every box, every corner. There was nothing else, no sign that anyone had been there other than the blanket. No footprints, no open drawers, no dust disturbed. Just that blanket, folded with a precision that made the hairs on my arms stand up. After that, I stopped sleeping inside the apartment. I couldn't bring myself to stay there, not even for a few hours. I started sleeping in my car, leaving the interior lights on, the heater running low to keep the windows clear. The night air, even in August, felt safer than the basement unit. I would park on the street, staring up at the building, listening for anything, willing the sounds to stop. During the day, I would pack quickly, go out for long walks, sit in coffee shops with my laptop, pretending I was productive, but the sense of invasion never left me. Every noise inside the apartment, every creak, every faint rustle became amplified in my mind. The landlord insisted no one else had keys. He came by twice, once to check the plumbing and once to bring a minor repair kit, and I could see the confusion on his face when I described the blanket. He suggested maybe it was left by a previous tenant, but the blanket was too clean, too deliberately placed, and no previous tenant had mentioned leaving anything behind. The upstairs unit remained empty. I started keeping a detailed journal, writing down times, noises, patterns. The breathing in the storage room always happened between 11:30 and midnight. The footsteps above the ceiling synced oddly with my showers. The noises stopped when I cooked, and then they started again when I left. The apartment became a place I could no longer call mine, a space that felt monitored, measured, cataloged by someone I could not see. I didn't report it to the police. The thought of them coming in, inspecting, finding nothing tangible, and leaving me feeling ridiculous was too much. I just packed what I could fit into bags and left the rest. I didn't even unpack my clothes fully, didn't bother setting up my bed. I spent the remaining weeks of the lease sleeping in my car, showering at friends' houses, eating takeout because I couldn't face being inside for long enough to cook. The blanket remained in my mind, folded and deliberate, a silent accusation I could not place or answer. When the lease ended, I moved out without looking back. I didn't sign anything further, didn't ask for keys, didn't even retrieve the few remaining items. I drove away with my car full of essentials, leaving the apartment locked and silent, the building empty above it. I never returned, never wanted to know if it happened again. The memory stayed with me, the rhythm of the breathing, the blanket that appeared out of nowhere, the realization that someone had been inside, or at least close enough to make me feel like they were. I have lived alone in other apartments since, but nothing has ever felt quite as violating, as quietly terrifying, as that basement unit. I still think about it sometimes, the way the noises knew when I was where I was, the way the apartment became an environment designed to unsettle me without ever showing a face. The apartment was cheap and available, but it cost me something I have never fully recovered: a sense of safety in my own home. I was watching my cousin's house in July 2011 while he was deployed. It was a single-story home tucked into a quiet suburb just outside Phoenix, surrounded by desert that stretched for miles. The streets were wide, the lawns sparse, and the heat pressed down during the day so heavily that even the shade offered little relief. I had agreed to house sit because he had asked, and I needed a quiet place to work on my writing. At first, the house felt empty but harmless, the kind of stillness you notice only when you are used to constant background noise. The air conditioning hummed faintly in the background, and the occasional pop or crack of the tiles or walls from the heat was expected. Those first few nights, the sounds were ordinary, part of the rhythm of a home in the desert. But soon, I noticed things that didn't fit. The first night, I woke around 2 in the morning to a dull dragging noise across the tile in the kitchen. It was slow, deliberate, heavier than anything that should have been moving on its own. I froze, listening as it stopped the moment I shifted in bed. I told myself it was the wind, a branch brushing the side of the house, or maybe the settling of the structure. I got up, checked the kitchen, the living room, the hallways, and found nothing. Every drawer was closed, every appliance in place. The sound never returned until the next night. Always the same slow, heavy dragging, always stopping as soon as I moved. During the day, everything seemed normal. Sunlight streamed through the windows, the desert air smelled dry and sharp, and the house appeared just as it had when my cousin had left. I tried to rationalize the nighttime noises as my imagination, as sleep-deprived paranoia. But it became harder to convince myself when I noticed other signs. One evening, I had been reading in my bedroom with the window open, enjoying the rare desert breeze that slipped through the screen. I glanced outside and froze. There were handprints pressed into the glass, high above the window frame, higher than my shoulders. Clean, clear, intentional handprints that didn't belong to me. My heart raced as I traced the marks with my eyes. The wall outside was smooth stucco. There were no ledges, no way for anyone to have climbed to that height unnoticed. I went around the house, checking doors and other windows, and everything was locked. I couldn't find any other signs of entry, nothing out of place inside or outside. The quiet started to terrify me more than the noises. Every night, between roughly 2 and 3 a.m., the neighborhood fell completely silent. No insects chirped, no air conditioners hummed, no distant cars passed. The desert itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. I began to notice the timing and started keeping track, staring at the clock each night as the stillness descended. It was oppressive, unnatural, as though the silence had weight, pressing down on me and the house at once. It made every other sound, the smallest squeak or shift, feel amplified. My own breathing became loud in my ears. The quiet was not just an absence of noise, it was awareness. I spent those nights pacing the living room, checking locks and peering out windows, feeling watched but never seeing anyone. I avoided the kitchen and hallways during the silent hour, staying close to the bedrooms where I could retreat if something happened. I tried to sleep with a fan running, but the sound of air blowing only reminded me that I was awake, alert to every scrape or scuff in the tile. I stopped leaving anything in plain view that could make noise. Even a dropped pen would jolt me awake, my mind racing to identify movement that might not exist. The final night was the worst. I had prepared myself mentally to endure it, telling myself I could wait until sunrise and leave immediately afterward. Around 3 a.m., I woke with a weight on the mattress near my feet. It was soft but firm, like someone had sat down carefully, testing the limits of balance so as not to make a sound. My body froze. I didn't move my head. I didn't breathe more than necessary. I forced myself to stay completely still, staring at the ceiling, counting seconds as they stretched into minutes. My mind went over every possibility. There was no window open, no door unlocked. I had checked everything twice before bed. And yet, I could feel the pressure, subtle but undeniable, as if someone was intentionally trying not to disturb me. I stayed still for what felt like hours, though it was probably 20 minutes, until the first hints of sunlight filtered through the blinds. When the weight lifted, I did not check behind me. I could not. I waited until the light grew stronger, until the world outside seemed ordinary again. and then I left. I didn't shower, didn't grab anything beyond a small bag with essentials, and didn't look back. I spent the day driving, refusing to return, refusing even to think about the house. The streets of the suburb were quiet, normal now under the sun, and I tried to remind myself that the events of the night had no evidence, no explanation, and that fear can be a trick of the mind. I didn't return to the house for the rest of my cousin's deployment. I left a note explaining my departure, vague and cautious. I never asked him to check inside. I never wanted to know if anyone had actually entered. Years later, the memory is sharp. I can still feel the weight on the mattress, the deliberate timing of the dragging noises, the handprints that seemed to mock my presence. I never stayed in another house alone in that neighborhood. The experience left me with a caution I cannot shake. It taught me that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits in silence, moves when it knows you are still, and leaves signs that are easy to dismiss until it is too late. I never needed proof. The fear was enough. I never returned, and I never will. The house remains in my memory as a place that was not simply empty, but watched, measured, and respected by someone I never saw. I stayed alone in my childhood home for a few weeks in 2019, shortly after my father passed. My mother couldn't bear to be there yet, so I volunteered to sort through paperwork, organize drawers, and prepare some of the furniture for sale. The house sat on a quiet street in a small coastal town in Maine, set back from the road with a lawn overgrown at the edges and a narrow path leading to the front door. The air smelled faintly of salt from the nearby ocean, mixed with the mustiness of a house that had been lived in for decades. Walking through it felt like stepping into the past, into the spaces where my father's routines had been woven into every corner. The first night was mostly ordinary, though I had to get used to silence. The house had always held subtle noises, the creak of floorboards, the soft groan of the walls as they expanded and contracted in the cold night air, the occasional whistle of wind through a poorly sealed window. I noticed these and barely registered them as anything unusual. I spent the first day going through paperwork, opening drawers and boxes, rearranging things, making small piles of papers to sort, and cleaning around furniture that would eventually be sold. The house felt lived in but empty, the kind of emptiness that makes every sound sharper and every shadow longer. It wasn't until the second night that I started to notice something off. At exactly 1:17 a.m., I heard the first set of steps. They started at the far end of the hallway, deliberate and slow, walking the length of the hall with brief pauses, then stopping just as suddenly as they began. I froze in my bed, listening to the rhythm, the faint squeak of the floorboards under something heavier than the weight of a cat or small animal. At first, I thought I might be imagining it, grief twisting my awareness of familiar sounds into something sinister. But when it happened again the next night, at precisely the same minute, I began to pay attention. The hallway was long, stretching from the front of the house to the back, with doors leading to bedrooms and a bathroom along its length. The sound of the steps moved past each door, deliberate, measured, stopping at intervals that seemed to match the pause in my own heartbeat. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to pass, forcing myself not to move. The floors were solid oak, the old varnish still intact, and every shift in weight carried through the wood, echoing slightly in the quiet house. I checked the security system the next day, hoping for some rational explanation. Motion sensors in the living room had registered movement every night, but the camera footage showed nothing. When I reviewed it, the camera pointed at a blank wall, as though someone had rotated it manually. Nothing else had moved. No shadows, no figures, just the blank expanse of wallpaper. The logs showed motion exactly at 1:17 a.m., consistent with the sound of footsteps. I couldn't explain it. I double-checked all doors and windows, all locks and entry points, and everything was secure. As the days passed, the steps became part of my nightly routine. I began staying awake until after they happened, marking the time on my phone. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, and watched the hallway in the dim light of my bedroom. During the day, I tried to stay busy, sorting paperwork, stacking books, moving furniture, dusting shelves and corners that hadn't been touched in years. The house seemed quieter in the daytime, ordinary, and the familiarity of it comforted me. But at night, even with the lights on, I felt watched. The steps had a rhythm, a precision, as if someone had memorized the layout of the house and followed it intentionally. On the final night, I stayed in the living room, laptop in front of me, lights dimmed, coffee cooling in a mug beside my arm. Around 1 a.m., I started to feel the anticipation, the way my chest tightened before the steps arrived. When they began, I sat still, watching the hallway, counting the pauses. It felt longer that night, the silence stretching around the sound of the measured footfalls. After they passed, I tried to shake the unease and head upstairs to check the attic one last time before I left the next day. When I opened the attic ladder, it was down, extending from the ceiling into the hall. Dust coated every rung except the top two, which were clean and shiny as if recently touched. My stomach dropped. I hadn't opened the attic in months, not since my father's passing, and I was certain no one else had been inside. The clean rungs suggested deliberate movement. Someone had been in the attic, moving around, yet leaving no other sign of entry or disturbance. I ran my hand along the dusty wood, hesitant to touch the top rungs. I checked the attic as best I could, shining a flashlight across stored boxes and old furniture, and found nothing else. No footprints, no displaced items, no evidence of someone lingering longer than a moment. I didn't stay to investigate further. I packed the last of my things hastily, leaving the house unlocked. I didn't care about security cameras or doors. I drove away without looking back, feeling the weight of the house pressing against the windshield as I pulled onto the quiet street. I never returned. The house remained behind me, a place that had once been familiar and now felt unknowable. Years later, I can recall the rhythm of those steps, the timing that never varied, the feeling of deliberate observation. The clean attic rungs, the security logs, the camera that always pointed away. All of it lingers in memory as evidence that someone or something had been inside, following routines I couldn't see. The fear wasn't violent or loud. It was precise, measured, and patient. It stayed with me in the same way grief does, quiet, persistent, leaving marks that are invisible but impossible to forget. I never returned to the house, never attempted to sell the furniture or finish the paperwork. I let it sit, empty and untouched, and that decision has remained the only one that feels fully right. The house was mine once, in memory and blood, but in the end, it became something else entirely, a place that required leaving. I rented the room in late September 2016, an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town in Ontario. The place had been empty for most of the year, and the owner lived hundreds of kilometers away, which is why the rent was cheap. I was only supposed to be there for 3 weeks, covering a seasonal job at a nearby orchard. The first day, when I walked in, the house smelled faintly metallic, a cold tang that settled in the back of my throat. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the walls carried a faint echo, as if the entire structure were listening. The windows were thick with age, the glass rippled slightly, and the frames were streaked with condensation that froze overnight. Outside, the trees were losing their leaves, the air sharp with the early October chill. The first night was quiet, except for the occasional creak of settling timber. I slept in the small room at the back of the house, where the windows looked over the orchard fields. The moon was bright enough that I could see the frost forming on the grass outside. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a slow, deliberate sound on the gravel outside. Footsteps. They weren't erratic. They followed a steady, measured rhythm, circling the house at a pace that suggested someone was taking their time, inspecting it. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to convince myself it was an animal, a neighbor, someone checking their property, anything ordinary. But the steps continued for several minutes, then stopped suddenly. When I finally mustered the courage to look, there was nothing. No person, no tracks, nothing disturbed in the soft frost. Over the next few days, the unease grew slowly. The pipes knocked in patterns I couldn't predict. Sometimes they synchronized with my movements. The shower would finish, and I'd hear the slow, hollow taps on the pipes above, almost as if someone were pacing. At first, I assumed the house was simply old, but a gnawing part of me couldn't let go of the feeling that the noises were deliberate. The radio in the living room turned on by itself once. I had left it unplugged, yet it hummed low static in the middle of the night. The sound was soft enough to be ignorable, but it didn't match any automatic power cycle I knew of. I turned it off, left the room, and when I returned in the morning, it was off. The snow came earlier than I expected, settling heavily by mid-October. It covered the yard in a soft white, muting the usual farm sounds. The tracks outside the windows were the first thing that truly unsettled me. They were long-strided, too far apart for a normal person trudging through fresh snow, and they circled the house in patterns that made no sense, around corners over uneven ground, yet they never appeared to enter the house. I traced them carefully one morning, assuming they might belong to an animal, but they were too precise, too purposeful. I saw no paw prints, no drag marks, no indication that anything living had been aside from a human form. Inside, the little things began to pile up. Cabinets in the kitchen opened on their own. I never caught them mid-motion, but I would come into the kitchen to find doors wide open, then check again 5 minutes later and they were closed. It wasn't a hinge issue. The old locks clicked into place normally, and the doors required a deliberate push to move. Once, I found a drawer slightly pulled out, the utensils inside still arranged neatly, as if nothing had disturbed them. I double-checked the whole house for drafts or vibrations. There was nothing that could account for it. I began sleeping with the door to my room locked, even though I knew that it could be forced with minimal effort if someone wanted to. The footsteps continued outside at irregular intervals, always slow, always deliberate. Sometimes they appeared in the early evening, sometimes near dawn. On a couple of occasions, I could hear a faint shuffle on the porch, then nothing. My nerves frayed steadily. I felt the weight of the emptiness pressing down on me, the silence of the uninhabited rooms wrapping around the sounds outside like a cloak. The most disturbing day was a Saturday, the 12th of October. I woke to find a neat pile of straw and leaves beneath the staircase leading to the second floor. I searched the entire house. No animals were inside, no signs of pests or rodents. The pile was perfectly formed, too tidy to be the work of wind or stray wildlife. I crouched there for a long time, turning the leaves over with my fingers, inspecting every corner. The straw was dry, clean, and smelled faintly of the outdoors. How it had gotten inside was impossible to explain. My first thought was that someone had broken in during the night, but there was no evidence. No scuff marks on the floor, no broken locks, no sign of a forced entry anywhere. By that point, I realized I could not remain. Every night, the noises, the footsteps, the subtle disruptions inside the house chipped away at my sense of safety. I felt watched, studied, though I could not see anyone. I packed quickly, taking only what I needed, and left the keys in a small envelope on the kitchen counter. I forfeited my deposit without hesitation. The snow was thick that morning, and I traced my own tire tracks through the driveway, avoiding glances at the windows. From the car, the house looked inert, silent, ordinary. But I knew that beneath the surface, it held a presence I could not explain. Driving away, I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was a squatter, someone hiding nearby, someone who had left the straw deliberately as a message or mark. Maybe the long tracks were just anomalies, elongated impressions from my own imagination in the dim light. Maybe the cabinets were poorly hung and moved with drafts I hadn't noticed. But every rational explanation felt inadequate. The slow pacing outside, the silent intrusions, the deliberate placement of straw. It all hinted at awareness, an unseen attention that could not be ignored. I never returned. Months later, I told myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by isolation. But the memory of those long, measured footsteps around the house remained vivid. Even now, when I imagine that farmhouse, the faint metallic smell, the soft creak of the floors, and the cold quiet of early snow bring it back. It was simple, grounded, and completely human, or at least it felt human enough to terrify me. The fear wasn't of ghosts or monsters, but of being watched, of the realization that the world outside my own control could intrude into the smallest, most private spaces. The clarity of that realization, and the strange, deliberate signs of someone or something moving around a house that should have been empty, stayed with me far longer than any fleeting terror. I sometimes think about that pile of straw, neatly tucked under the staircase, and the slow, careful footsteps circling the house at night. I will never know who, if anyone, made them, but I do know why I left, and I know that the house, silent and ordinary in daylight, had contained a presence I could not stay to confront. It was enough to make me leave, and once I did, the fear evaporated. The farmhouse returned to silence, and I returned to my life, certain that the house and I had crossed paths just briefly, leaving an imprint neither of us could explain, and that I would not risk again. It was 3 weeks of isolation, strange signs, and impossible explanations, ending with a clear, undeniable decision. I was done. I would not question it, would not look back, and would not return. The house was empty in every practical sense, yet full of something I could feel but could not name. Walking away, leaving the keys behind, was the only rational choice, and it was enough. I was 11 in the spring of 2003, living in a small rural town in Ohio. My parents worked long hours, and I was often left alone for a couple of hours after school. It wasn't unusual for me to be the only person in the house until they returned from work, and I had never felt anything particularly wrong in those afternoons. The house was old, wooden, with creaking floors and low ceilings in some rooms, but it had always felt safe. Our property was set back from the road, surrounded by fields, and the neighbors were far enough that it was quiet, almost completely isolated in the early afternoons. I remember that day specifically because it started like any other. The kitchen smelled faintly of the lunch I had eaten earlier, peanut butter and jelly with a glass of milk. I had my homework spread across the dining table, a notebook and pencil, and the TV was on in the living room, though I was mostly focused on a simple math worksheet. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, landing in rectangles across the wooden floor, and the faint ticking of the wall clock blended with the hum of the refrigerator. Everything was calm, ordinary. Then I heard it. My name called from the basement. It was quiet, soft, almost like a murmur, but the tone was off. I froze at first, gripping my pencil. It sounded almost right, almost like my mother calling me, but too flat, too deliberate, lacking the warmth or the familiar inflection that I knew so well. The word echoed slightly, faint against the floorboards under my feet. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was impossible. The basement door was always closed, always locked when my parents left, and the lights were off. I had never been told to go down there alone, and at 11, I knew better than to ignore that. I got up slowly, moving toward the living room for a better view of the basement door from the couch. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to breathe, rationalizing. Maybe it was the house settling, maybe an echo from the kitchen, a reflection of sound bouncing through the floorboards, maybe the wind in the cracks of the old windows. But the basement door was open. It should have been closed, always closed. A cold, creeping unease settled in my chest, heavier than the summer heat could have produced. I could see the stairs leading down into darkness, the top step illuminated slightly by the hall light above. I could see the shadow of the open door stretching across the floor. I didn't move closer. I sat rigidly on the couch, staring at it, unwilling to step a single foot toward the basement. Time slowed. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through the old house felt amplified. I didn't hear footsteps, not really. I didn't see anyone. But the image of that door, open when it should have been closed, stayed in my mind. I tried to keep busy, focusing on my homework, forcing the numbers on the page to make sense. But every few seconds, I glanced up, and the door remained open, and the darkness beyond seemed to breathe, waiting. I didn't attempt to close it. I didn't dare. I waited, counting the minutes in my head, until finally, the sound of the car pulling up in the driveway signaled my parents' return. Relief washed over me like a wave. That night, I went to bed with the lights on, the floor lamp casting a yellow circle across the room. Sleep came in fits, broken by every creak of the house. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement door, about the voice that had called my name, about how it had sounded almost real but not quite. My parents never asked if I had been alone, and I never told them. I didn't want to seem foolish. The next morning, the house seemed unchanged, ordinary again in the clear sunlight. But when I went to the basement to fetch some old board games my parents had stored down there, I froze. Muddy footprints climbed the stairs. 1, 2, 3 for steps all the way up, stopping one step below the door. The prints were dark against the worn wood, irregular in size, slightly larger than my own shoes. I ran my fingers over the wood, half expecting to find them damp, but they had dried overnight, set into the grain of the old steps. I checked the rest of the basement. Nothing disturbed, nothing moved. No signs of an intruder, no footprints beyond those on the stairs. No windows open, no doors forced. Nothing that could explain where the mud had come from or why it stopped so deliberately just short of the door. I thought about it for hours, pacing in the kitchen, my eyes drawn to the stairs through the dining room doorway. The prints were there, undeniable yet impossible. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't gone up into the main floor. Whoever had called my name hadn't stepped into the room where I had sat. And yet the stairs had been used, someone had been down there. It didn't make sense. I couldn't reconcile the calm of the house with what I had experienced. In the weeks that followed, I checked the basement obsessively, always finding it locked, always finding the stairs empty. My parents never noticed anything unusual. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a neighbor's child had wandered in through a basement window and gone back out. But the windows were locked and the yard was fenced. Maybe a stray animal had climbed up the steps. But the prints were human, and the mud was heavy, not paw-shaped. My 11-year-old mind had nothing to offer except a deep, persistent unease. I became hyper-aware of the house's sounds. The low hum of the furnace, the taps of the water pipes, the groan of the floorboards. I could feel every creak as though it were the echo of that day. I never heard my name called from the basement again, and the footprints never reappeared. Time passed, and the memory faded into the normal nervousness of being a child left alone. But the house never felt the same. Every time I went down the stairs, I remembered the open door, the darkness beyond, and the deliberate, frozen step of the muddy footprint. It was a small thing, an ordinary house, but those stairs, the call of my name, and the prints stopped just short of the doorway had left a permanent mark on my perception of safety. Years later, I understand what it was. Someone had been inside, someone who had gained access without leaving signs beyond that single, unnerving trace. Nothing supernatural, nothing elaborate. Just a human presence that had entered, moved carefully, and left without further evidence. I don't know if it was a neighbor, a stranger, or someone who had observed our routines. I don't know why the voice sounded so flat, so wrong. I don't know why they stopped on the step below the door. But I know the facts. The door was open, the lights were off, the voice called my name, and the prints appeared. I never forgot that day. I never left the door to the basement open again. Never let curiosity overcome caution. And never assumed the house was empty just because it appeared that way. The footprints on the stairs, frozen in time, were a silent reminder that people could be closer than we realize, moving unseen, leaving only the faintest traces behind. That quiet, deliberate intrusion, and the knowledge that I had been watched without my awareness, stayed with me long after childhood ended. The memory is clear, vivid, and fully explained in its simplest form. Someone had been there, and I had been completely alone, powerless to know more. And that, I realized, was enough to make an ordinary house feel completely unsafe. I bought the cabin in western Montana in late January 2021. It had been on the market for years, a small, cedar-sided structure perched on a rise with dense forest surrounding it on three sides and a frozen creek running a few hundred meters below. There were no neighbors close enough to see or hear me, no roads that were regularly plowed in the winter, and I liked the isolation. I had worked remotely for months, and the promise of quiet, away from everything, was exactly what I wanted. The snow came early that year, settling thick and fast across the property, muffling sound and coating every surface in heavy white. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting skin even through gloves, and the sky often hung low and gray. I stayed alone in the cabin during the first major snowstorm of February, wanting to test the place and see if it would feel like home. The first evening, I felt the usual creaks of settling wood and the soft groan of the heating system, but it was nothing alarming. Outside, the wind drove the snow against the cabin walls, creating the kind of muffled roar you expect when the world is buried under a foot or more of fresh snow. I unpacked minimally, made tea, and sat in the living room, watching the storm paint the trees white. Around 9 that night, I heard it. A knock. Slow. 3 distinct hits. Not on the door, not the window, but somewhere in the wall to the right of the kitchen. At first, I thought it might be the wind, a branch scraping against the siding. But the pattern repeated. 3 knocks, then silence for about 10 minutes, then 3 more. I walked carefully through the cabin, checking each window, each wall. Nothing had been disturbed outside. The snow near the walls was smooth, untouched, like no one had been there. I pressed my hands against the cold exterior siding where I thought the sound originated. There was nothing unusual, no hollows, no gaps, no loose boards. The noise had a weight, a presence behind it that the wind and settling wood did not. I spent the rest of the night trying to ignore it, reading in front of the fire, telling myself it was probably a settling sound I had never noticed before, amplified by the snowstorm and the silence. But the knocking persisted, low and methodical. Every 10 minutes, 3 deliberate hits, echoing faintly through the cabin. When I checked again in the morning, the snow remained undisturbed near the walls. But on the roofline above the cabin, the snow had deep impressions, depressions that followed the slope as if something had climbed up and paused there. Not claw marks, not footprints, just deep, wide impressions, as though weight had rested there for some time before sliding off. The sun had softened them slightly, but the shape was unmistakable. I measured them against my own weight. They were far too heavy for any animal I could imagine scaling the roof, not to mention staying still in near-zero temperatures. I told myself there must be a rational explanation. Perhaps a branch had fallen and pressed into the snow, then slid down. Maybe an animal had attempted to climb the roof and retreated. But the knocking continued that night, more insistent now. I sat in the living room for hours, fire low, listening as 3 measured hits echoed through the walls. My mind calculated rational scenarios endlessly, weighing possibilities, considering wind pressure, snow slides, settling timber. Nothing fit. Each theory had gaps. The knocks didn't move, they didn't vary. They were deliberate. Around midnight, I moved upstairs to the loft. The cabin had a small open loft above the living area, separated by a low railing. I had set up a sleeping space there for the first night. The floorboards were thin, creaking under any step, and the roofline sloped sharply. I lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling and the shadows cast by the flickering firelight below. The knocking started again, soft but audible even above the howl of the storm outside. Then, distinct, measured breathing. Slow, deliberate, coming from the loft above me. I didn't move at first. My heart pounded in a rhythm faster than the breathing, in sync with the knocks. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the sound carrying through the open space, the wind, the furnace cycling. But the weight and consistency of it made that impossible. The breathing had a proximity, a presence that no ambient noise could replicate. It moved slightly, shifting as if adjusting its position. I stayed perfectly still for hours. I didn't attempt to leave the loft, didn't attempt to confront whatever was there. Couldn't. The rational part of me kept counting possibilities. Animal, intruder, snow collapse causing weird acoustic reflections. But the human element, the awareness implied by the knocks, the pattern, the breathing refused to be dismissed. By morning, the storm had lightened, the snow drifting softly over the roof again. But the impressions remained, clear enough that I could track their path with my eyes. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting upright in the loft, fire flickering low, checking the windows and doors repeatedly. My phone had no signal and I was entirely alone. The morning was gray, the sky heavy with more snow to come, and I finally made a decision. The house, for all its beauty and isolation, was not a safe or comfortable place for me. Rational explanations might exist, but I did not want to spend another night confronting them. I packed a small bag, locked the cabin, and drove out through the snow, leaving the property for the first time. In the months that followed, I tried to sell the house. I returned only once to retrieve mail and supplies, each time noting the quiet and the deep isolation that initially drew me there. The impressions on the roofline, the memory of the deliberate knocking, the slow breathing above me, all remained vivid. I realized that isolation magnifies uncertainty, that the absence of neighbors, of routine, of oversight leaves a space for perception to amplify. But even with rational explanations considered, there was a presence I could feel, deliberate and measured, and I didn't want to risk it. 6 months after the storm, the cabin sold. I never slept there again. The firewood stacked neatly outside remained untouched, the windows frosted over, the roofline smooth again in winter snows. To this day, I remember the sound of the knocks, each echoing in the quiet snow-covered walls, and the low, deliberate breathing in the loft. There was no need for ghosts, no monsters, nothing supernatural. The house was ordinary, the storm real, the snow heavy, and yet the events were enough to make me abandon a property I had wanted. The explanation, as simple and real as it could be, was this. I had been alone in a place completely isolated, confronted by signs of a presence I could neither identify nor ignore. It was enough to make me leave, and it was enough to convince me that some places, no matter how beautiful or quiet, are not meant to be occupied alone. I sold the cabin and never returned, leaving the story of the snow, the knocks, and the breathing behind me as evidence of how ordinary circumstances can become profoundly unsettling when the ordinary suddenly feels deliberate. I moved into a small rental house in a quiet suburb of Portland in late February 2018. I had just started a new job and needed a place I could afford on my own. The house was older, built in the 1950s, with narrow hallways, low ceilings, and wood floors that creaked in every room. The landlord lived across town and rarely visited, which suited me. I liked the idea of complete privacy, of having a place to myself, where I could come home from work and feel like the entire house belonged to me. The first week was normal. I unpacked slowly, put pictures on the walls, and arranged the furniture. The floorboards groaned under my weight, but I assumed that was part of living in an old house. I noticed the faint smell of damp wood near the back hallway, but it didn't bother me. I kept the windows open during the day to air it out. I worked long hours, came home tired, and went to bed early. After the first week, small things started happening. At first, it was subtle. A kitchen towel I knew I had left folded on the counter ended up crumpled on the floor. I thought I had done it myself in a rush and forgot. The next night, I put a pan to soak in the sink. When I returned, it was sitting in the middle of the counter, dry and empty. The first time it happened, I froze for a moment, then shook my head and told myself it was impossible. No one else had a key. By the second week, I started noticing noises. Footsteps above me at odd hours, though the upstairs was empty and the ceiling above my bedroom was just the attic. They were slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the house to the other, then stopping. Once, I heard a soft scraping sound along the hallway floorboards, like someone dragging something heavy. I would lie awake, listening, convincing myself it was just the house settling. But then the sounds started syncing with my own movements. When I went to the kitchen, I would hear a floorboard creak just behind me, even though no one was there. I began checking the locks multiple times each night. Every door was locked, every window latched. I checked the attic hatch in the hallway. It was sealed. The feeling of being watched grew heavier, like the house had become alive in a way that was aware of me. At night, I slept in the living room instead of the bedroom because I could see the doors and the windows from there. I left a chair in front of the back door, imagining someone trying to get in. One morning, I woke to find the living room rug moved. It was rolled slightly at one end, something I definitely hadn't done. My heart raced as I crouched and checked under the furniture. Nothing was there. I started leaving small cameras in the hallway and kitchen, hoping to catch what was happening. I didn't review the footage at first. I couldn't bear to know. The house was silent during the day, and the noises only came after dark. The cabinets became the next source of unease. I always kept them closed. One evening, I came home to find the sugar jar open, though I had locked the lid the night before. The pantries were fine, but a few items were displaced. I stared at the cabinets for a long time, considering the possibility that I was sleepwalking. I began recording my own movements at night with my phone, placing it on the counter before bed. The recordings were worse than I imagined. I woke to see the timestamp, 2:17 a.m. The footage showed the kitchen light flick on, the cabinet doors swinging open one by one. Nothing moved in the frame, but the doors opened, slowly, deliberately. I froze, staring at the screen, feeling a weight in my chest I had never felt before. I went through the footage frame by frame. No wind, no vibration from the floorboards, nothing in the frames to explain it. I stopped leaving my phone out. I began sleeping in my clothes, ready to bolt if I heard anything. The sound of footsteps was now almost constant at night. They circled the living room, the hallway, sometimes pausing outside the bedroom. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass under the crack of my bedroom door. I didn't dare open it. One night, I woke to the smell of something metallic, faint but unmistakable, like rust or blood. I got out of bed and checked every window, every door. Nothing. Then I noticed the snow outside had been trampled. Tracks led up to the windows, long, deliberate strides, as though someone had walked around the house. I checked the driveway, no footprints leading away, just the marks around the house. I stared at the snow for what felt like hours, heart thudding, convinced I would see someone emerge from the treeline. The final incident happened in the early morning, around 5:30. I had barely slept, sitting in the living room with a coffee. I looked at the staircase and saw something that made my stomach drop. Straw and dried leaves had been piled neatly under the bottom step. I searched the house. No animals, nothing hidden in the corners. The pile hadn't been there when I went to bed. I realized then that I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things in a haze, didn't sleep, and left before sunrise, leaving the deposit behind. I never found a rational explanation. No neighbors reported seeing anyone. No one admitted having keys. I asked the landlord afterward if anyone had entered before, but he insisted no one had. I never went back, never stayed alone in a house like that again. The memory of the footsteps, the cabinets, the tracks in the snow, and the smell of metal stayed with me for years. Even now, I can remember standing in that living room, alone, wondering how something or someone had watched me for 3 weeks without leaving a trace. I've stayed in other houses, apartments, and rentals since then, but I still check locks 3 or 4 times before bed, leave lights on in hallways, and sometimes leave a chair in front of a door, just in case. The sense of being watched, of small disturbances happening while I wasn't looking, hasn't left me. It feels like it lives in the memory of that house, and I carry it with me. I never thought a place could feel so alive, so aware, while remaining utterly empty.